A few years ago, our mall started having this event where they turn on a fog machine. It's not even associated with Halloween as far as I know, it's just its own thing. The mall management claimed it was to provide a sense of mystery and intrigue around the central fountain, which had always been somewhat of an eyesore. For reference, it had chipped tiles and stagnant water, but what started as a gimmick quickly turned into a local legend. The fog would roll out every evening around dusk, enveloping the fountain in an eerie, otherworldly mist. At first, it was a hit with shoppers. Kids would play hide and seek in the mist, and couples would sneak romantic moments under its cover. But then, people began to notice something off about the fountain at the heart of this artificial cloud. It was Emily, a regular at the mall, who first whispered the tale. She said she saw shapes moving within the fog, not just the usual patrons, but something else, something with a form that didn't quite fit the human silhouette. She described it as a shadow, tall and thin, with movements too fluid, like smoke dancing in the wind. Eventually, people started to steer clear of the fountain. The fog, once an attraction, became a deterrent. Stories spread, and some claimed to hear whispers, like the soft murmur of water but with a voice, beckoning. Others spoke of feeling an icy chill, not from the air conditioning, but from something within the fog itself. One night, after the mall had closed, a security guard named Mark decided to investigate. He had seen too many people avoid the area and heard too many whispers in the break room. Armed with just his flashlight and a growing sense of unease, Mark entered the fog. The mist was thicker than usual, almost tangible, as if it had a will of its own. As he approached the fountain, the water seemed to churn more violently than could be explained by the mechanics underneath. Mark shone his light into the fog, and for a moment he thought he saw nothing. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse. A figure, not quite human, its features blurred by the mist. And yet its eyes, if you could call them that, glowed with an unnatural light. Mark felt a cold hand on his shoulder, spinning around to find nothing but the fog. His heart raced, the flashlight trembling in his grip. He backed away, but not before he heard it. A voice, clear this time, not a whisper but a command. Stay. That was the last anyone saw of Mark. The next day, his flashlight was found at the bottom of the fountain, but there was no sign of him. After that incident, the fog machine event stopped abruptly. The mall tried to keep things under wraps, but the story eventually got out. The fountain was drained, but no one dared to clean it. It sat empty and silent, the tiles now not just chipped, but cracked, as if something had tried to claw its way out. And now, on certain nights, when the air is still and the mall is eerily quiet, you can see a fog forming around where the fountain once was, even though no machine is there anymore. And if you listen closely, you might hear a voice, soft and coaxing, inviting you closer. But don't stay and listen too long. Back when my wife was pregnant with our second daughter, Emily, we were looking at houses as we needed a bigger one. Inadvertently, we saw one house that was a bit out of our price range. It had just about every amenity you could imagine, even including an indoor fountain. The house itself was beautiful, almost too good to be true with its sprawling layout and modern design. The fountain was in the atrium, a serene feature that seemed to breathe life into the very space. Its waters trickled down in a calming cascade, but there was something about the mist it produced that felt off. We decided to take a tour, and the realtor was eager, perhaps too eager, to show us around. As we approached the fountain, she mentioned how the previous owners had installed it as a centerpiece, claiming it brought peace to the home. But as we stood there, watching the gentle mist rise, I felt a chill, not from the cool air, but from an inexplicable sense of foreboding. That night, after we left, I couldn't shake the feeling. My wife, feeling the weight of pregnancy, was tired but happy with the house. However, I was restless. In the quiet of our current home, I did some research on the address. What I found was quite unsettling. The house had changed hands several times in the last few years, each owner staying for less time than the one before. The last family moved out abruptly, leaving most of their belongings behind. No one could give a clear reason why, but rumors spoke of odd occurrences centered around the fountain. Eventually curiosity got the better of me, and a few days later we went for another look. This time I noticed something I hadn't before. The mist from the fountain seemed thicker, almost like a fog, even though the water flowed in the same serene manner. As we stood there, the air grew colder, and I could have sworn I saw figures within the mist, fleeting and ghostly. Our daughter, little Emily, who was with us, suddenly started crying. Not just the fuss of a tired toddler, but a scream filled with terror. We scooped her up and left, but not before I noticed something in the water, a reflection that wasn't ours, something distorted and watching. We didn't buy the house, but the story didn't end there. A few months later, after Emily was born, we heard that the house was sold again. The new owners were a young couple, and within weeks they reported to the police about strange sounds at night, like whispers from the fountain and shadows moving through the fog it created. One night they decided to film the fountain to catch whatever was causing the disturbances. What they captured was chilling. In the video, the fog seemed to form into figures, moving and almost dancing around the fountain. The next morning, the husband was found by the fountain, his eyes wide open, staring blankly into the mist, as if he had seen something beyond human comprehension. Then the house went back on the market, but with a new legend attached to it. People say that on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can hear the fountain whispering, inviting you into its fog, where the boundary between the living and whatever dwells within the mist blurs. We obviously never went back, but the memory of that indoor fountain still haunts me, a reminder of the things we don't understand, lurking just beneath the surface of normalcy. In middle school, my class went on this field trip to a nature preserve. Besides visiting the little museum type thing they had there and eating our picnic lunches, we spent a good hour walking around on the trails. I remember that day was extremely foggy, to the point that me and my classmates were all laughing that we would get lost in the fog. It was so thick it felt like we were walking through clouds, the sounds of the forest were muffled, and it created an eerie sense of isolation. Our teacher, Mrs. Jenkins, tried to keep us all together, but the fog had a way of making groups drift apart. We ended up at this clearing where the fog seemed to thin slightly, revealing an old, moss-covered fountain. The fountain was unlike anything you'd expect in a nature preserve. It looked ancient, with statues of figures that seemed to be in a perpetual dance around the basin. The water, or what we thought was water, was still, almost black under the muted light. There was no sound of trickling water, instead just an unsettling quiet. Our teacher told us a bit about it, saying it was from an old estate that used to be on the property before it was turned into a preserve. She didn't know much more, but one of the local guides with us whispered to her something about the Fog Mountain being cursed or haunted. We all laughed it off, but there was an edge to our laughter. As we stood there, the fog seemed to grow denser around us, as if it was drawn to the fountain. One of my friends, Jake, dared me to touch the water. I hesitated, but peer pressure won out. As I reached into the cold, dark water, I felt something grab my wrist, not just cold water, but something solid like a hand. And yet, when I yanked my arm back, there was nothing on my skin, just the chill. We decided to move on, but the fog seemed to follow us, or rather, we seemed to walk in circles, always coming back to the fountain. The guide looked increasingly nervous, his eyes darting to the fog and then back to us. He mumbled about how we needed to leave before dark, saying something about the fog being unnatural around the fountain. And then, it happened. We heard laughter, not from any of us, but from within the fog, a childlike giggle that echoed strangely. Then the air grew colder, and shapes began to form in the mist, figures that looked like they were from another time, dancing around us just as the statues did around the fountain. Panic set in and we ran, but the fog obscured our path. I remember looking back once, seeing the fountain, now with figures moving around it, their outlines blending with the mist. They weren't laughing anymore, their mouths were open in silent screams. We finally broke free of the fog, finding ourselves back at the start of the trail, where the fog was just normal now, the preserve's usual haze. No one spoke of what we saw. It was as if we had collectively decided it was too terrifying to acknowledge. Years later, I heard the nature preserve had closed that section off, claiming it was for environmental reasons. However, locals whispered it was because no one could explain the disappearances or the strange, foggy apparitions seen near the fountain. Whenever I think of that day, the laughter from the fog, and the chill of that unnatural touch, I wonder what truly lies within the dance of the fog by that haunted fountain. This story happened just yesterday, so it's still incredibly fresh on my mind. I had just gotten my new Intel Battlemage 580 graphics card and was about to upgrade my gaming rig. The card was rumored to have some unique features, but nothing could prepare me for what it would do in real life. After installing the card, I decided to test it out with some late-night gaming. The fog outside was unusually thick for our neighborhood, creating an eerie atmosphere that seemed to seep through my window. I was deep into a horror game when my screen flickered, not from the game, but from some external interference. Curious and a bit spooked, I looked out the window to see the source of this disturbance. Through the fog, I could just make out the old, forgotten fountain in the park across the street, a relic from when the area was more affluent. Tonight, the fog seemed to gather around it, almost like it was breathing. I returned to my game, but the screen kept glitching, displaying static bursts in the shape of the fountain. Then my PC's speakers started playing what sounded like water dripping, echoing through my room as if I were standing right next to the fountain. Suddenly, my new graphics card kicked in with an alert I had never seen before. It was running some kind of diagnostic, but the interface was unlike anything from Intel. Instead, it showed a thermal scan of my surroundings, highlighting the fountain in red, pulsing with an unnatural energy. I was about to dismiss it as a glitch when my computer started to overlay augmented reality images on my screen. It wasn't showing game graphics, but instead real-time visuals from outside my window. In the fog, shadows moved, not human, but too fluid, converging on the fountain. My heart raced as I realized what was happening. The fog wasn't just weather, it was alive, or at least something within it was. I tried to shut down my PC, thinking it was somehow connected to this phenomenon, but the graphics card wouldn't let me. Rather, it initiated what looked like a countermeasure protocol. On my screen, a digital representation of the fountain appeared, surrounded by what could only be described as spectral entities. Then, from the card, a burst of energy, or data, or maybe something beyond my understanding, shot out. My room filled with a light so bright it cast the fog aside like a curtain. Through the now clearing mist, I saw the fountain. The water was no longer still, it churned violently, and from it, figures of light emerged, battling the shadowy forms. My graphics card was somehow interfacing with this anomaly, using its advanced processing to counteract whatever dark force had been unleashed. The battle was silent but intense, the light from my card clashing with the darkness of the fog. Finally, with one last surge of energy, the shadows dissipated and the fog retreated, leaving the night calm once more. I sat back, my heart pounding, as my screen returned to normal. The Intel Arc B580 had not only saved me from a potentially terrifying encounter, but it also protected my neighborhood from something truly malevolent. The next day, I read in the local news about strange light phenomena in our area, but thankfully, no one seemed to connect it to the old fountain. I'm still unsure how my graphics card managed such a feat, but I've learned to respect the untold capabilities of Intel technology. Now, every time I game, I feel a bit safer, knowing that my Intel Battlemage 580 might have more surprises up its sleeve, ready to combat whatever lurks in the unseen corners of our world. In one of my engineering classes in college, my group and I had to design and then build a fountain that would emit fog as well. We were actually free to choose what to make, and didn't have to make it that complicated, but one of the other people on our team, Trevor, kept enthusiastically trying to sell us this idea. Apparently he'd wanted to make a fog machine for a while, so we figured why not. We spent weeks designing this intricate system where water would cascade down in a series of tiers, and at the base, the fog machine would create an ethereal mist. It was ambitious, but by the time we were done, it was impressive. The fountain was actually set up in the university's courtyard, ready for the end of semester exhibition. Finally, the night of the exhibition came. The fog machine worked perfectly, creating an almost magical scene under the moonlight. The fog enveloped the base of the fountain, giving it an otherworldly look. People gathered around, taking pictures and just marveling at our creation. However, as the night deepened and the crowd thinned, the atmosphere changed. The fog grew denser and more persistent, as if it had a life of its own. It started to spread beyond the fountain, creeping across the courtyard like a living thing. At this point we decided to check on it, thinking maybe there was a malfunction. But as we approached, the air grew colder and whispers began to fill the fog, soft at first, then growing louder. It wasn't the sound of water or machinery, these were voices, whispering in languages none of us understood. Trevor, who had been so excited about the project, looked pale, his enthusiasm replaced by fear. I didn't think it would do this, he muttered, his eyes wide as he stared into the mist. The fog wasn't just obscuring vision, it was shaping into forms, vague at first, but then becoming more distinct. Shadows moved within it, figures that were too tall, too thin to be human, their movements unnatural. They circled the fountain, as if it was a beacon calling them forth from some unseen realm. This is where panic began to set in. We tried to shut down the fog machine, but it wouldn't turn off. The controls were dead, unresponsive. In the meantime, the fog kept billowing out, now thick enough to make breathing difficult. One of our teammates, Sarah, started reciting something, maybe a prayer or a remembered incantation from a book she'd read, as if hoping it would dispel whatever we had unwittingly summoned. But the whispers only grew louder, now accompanied by a chilling laughter that seemed to come from the depths of the fog. We called campus security, but by the time they arrived, the fog had dissipated as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a normal, albeit slightly damp, courtyard. The fountain was just a fountain again, its water still, the fog machine silent. The next day, our project was taken down without much explanation. The university didn't want to delve into what happened, labeling it as an equipment malfunction. But Trevor, Sarah, and I knew better. We felt the chill, heard the whispers, and saw the shadows. Since then, none of us have looked at fog the same way. Every time I see a mist, I can't help but wonder if we accidentally opened a door to something beyond our understanding, something that might still be lurking and waiting for the right moment to return. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear those whispers again, carried on the wind, reminding me of the night the fog came to life.